Ia uite cine se mai uită din pușcărie. Tu și tatăl tău. If this dam fails, it pollutes half of Europe.
There used to be people living here, not in ancient history, not centuries ago, but within living memory. They had houses, fields, a church, and a cemetery, and then they were told to leave. What replaced them wasn't progress or
Geamăna,
development, but a
Da,
slowly
uite.
rising mass of industrial waste that is still being pumped into this valley to this day. This is Geamăna, and it's an example of what happens when governments could not care less about the well-being of their citizens. You join me today in western Romania, about 2 hours drive south of the city of Cluj, in the middle of nowhere in Transylvania, which is where I am. But I'm not here to do a sort of YouTube clickbaity, I stayed in a haunted castle, or I met Dracula's corpse as a zombie. I'm actually here to talk about something way spookier than that, bureaucratic negligence. This is Geamăna, which apparently translates to twin in Romanian, which is a bit odd. It's a big lake, but straight off the bat, there are a couple of things about it that you might notice that make it a little bit unlike other lakes. The first is...
Ăsta e lacul ăla de-a fost de inundat un sat întreg din cauza că comuniștii au vrut să minerească ceva și au trebuit să deverseze căcaturi în sat și au zis că, bă, mai bine mutăm oamenii de acolo decât să... Da?
that it's a bit of a strange color.
Culmea că nu-i primul lucru. Era și insula aia de pe Dunăre de o trebui să o inunde.
Lakes are normally blue or maybe a bit brown, but this one is a pretty gross, opaque grey colour with bizarre, unnatural yellows and turquoises that give it a pretty ominous appearance, like it's begging you not to swim in it. And in this fictional world I've created in which lakes can talk, Geamăna is right to warn you not to indulge in a dip in its waters, partly because a huge proportion of what you're looking at now is not water. It's a concoction of extremely toxic, destructive chemicals that have wreaked havoc on everything in the vicinity, from the ecosystem to the communities that once called it home. Because believe it or not, beneath this thick layer of deadly sludge, there's actually an entire town lost to history. And the worst part of it all? This was all done on purpose. The year is 1977. Romania is 3 decades into life as the Socialist Republic of Romania and 12 years into the utterly bizarre reign of Nicolae Ceausescu, one of the strangest men to ever lead a European nation. Ceausescu's 24 years in charge were defined by 3 things. 1. An extremely suffocating and often unintentionally comic cult of personality, which saw him anoint himself with titles like the Genius of the Carpathians. 2.
Mamă, dacă exista AI-ul atunci când era Ceaușescu dictator. Făcea lumea compilații cu Ceaușescu.
A habit of personally meddling in every major policy area, from economics to foreign affairs, and usually with catastrophic results. And 3,
Bă, dar așa făceam și eu pe Minecraft, îmi însușeam rolul de dictator, deși eu nu știam nimic din ce fac. Numai lumea trebuia să creadă că știu ce fac, știi? Adică nu era că trebuie să știi ce faci, trebuie să te prefaci că știi ce faci.
Striking disregard for the well-being of his own people. While he was not as genocidal or industrially murderous as Joseph Stalin or Pol Pot, Romanians still suffered enormously under policies driven by his arrogance, micromanagement, and extreme lack of judgment. Despite being part of the Eastern Bloc, Romania had a fractured relationship with the USSR throughout the Cold War. Understatement of the century right there. And once Stalin died in 1953, Romania spent the next few decades annoying the shit out of Moscow. It remained part of the Eastern Bloc and the Warsaw Pact, a defensive alliance that basically served as the Soviets' answer to NATO, but was a constant naysayer and contrarian that refused to follow any sort of cross-country consensus on policy, including on nuclear weapons and trade. It even became a member of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank.
Dar știți de ce nu? asta nu e din cauza la politică, era din cauza că Ceaușescu avea laserul ăla foarte puternic. Deci ăsta putea cu laserul să tragă de pe Dunăre până la Kremlin. Că nu, pământul fiind plat, fasciculul de lumină ar fi putut să meargă drept de acolo și le era frică, mă. Le era frică la ruși să se bage în România.
Organizations which were kind of formed explicitly in opposition to communism in order to secure massive loans that weren't tied to Moscow. I wonder if this will backfire. In order to realize his grand vision for the future of Romania, Ceausescu used these loans to implement what he called the systematization of the country, which basically involved a mass build-out of industry across vast swathes of the nation, regardless of what was in the way. Systematization was influenced by North Korea's Juche policy, and I know it sounds mental to be inspired by North Korean domestic economic policy, but North Korea was actually booming during the 60s and even into the 70s, so it looked like a good blueprint for a nation if you ignored the mass disappearing of people.
Bă, deci, când s-a dus Ceaușescu în Coreea de Nord, mă, zici că au vizitat alt server, mă. L-au văzut pe adminul de acolo cum controlează tot serverul și a fost ciudă. Zic că vreau și eu, mă. Deci, de fiecare dată când am văzut chestii despre Ceaușescu, mie mi s-a părut că de fiecare dată când a ieșit din țară, au venit înapoi, vreau și eu chestia aia. Ați fost vreodată la casa lui. Aia din București. Să vedeți acolo câte chestii avea. Că-au văzut, te mir pe unde.
People in the prison camps, and so, using its gigantic loans from the West with little means of paying them back, Romania started building factories and mines across the nation. And one of the most important parts of the country in this regard were the Apuseni Mountains up here in Transylvania, known to be full of gold and copper since at least the Roman era. But while the region has been known for small-scale mining since practically forever, in the 60s, the second largest copper deposit in Europe was discovered, more accurately about here, and in the 1970s, plans were made to construct the most controversial mine in
Ceaușescu chiar a fost prost, că încă nu s-a băgat update-ul cu armura din cupru atunci, deci degeaba o stat el să mineze cupru, că nu-i folosea la nimic.
Romanian history, the gigantic, and I mean fucking gigantic, Roșia-Poieni copper mine. Cupru Min, the state-run mining company of Romania, broke ground on the mine in 1978, with the site quickly ballooning into one of the most significant mining operations in all of Europe, containing an estimated 1.5 billion tons of copper ore. Right, now, quick nerdy tangent. Would you believe me if I told you that I used to be a
Bun, aici o întrebare foarte serioasă pentru că eu chiar nu știu. Mereu mi s-a părut extrem de interesant stilul ăsta de a mineri. Eu ce văd aici pare, zici că literalmente un versant întreg de munte a fost ras de pe fața pământului, așa pe straturi. Tu câtă materie primă, și aici mă refer, uite, de exemplu, dacă săpau după cupru, cât cupru poți să găsești în jumătate de deal? Și tu de unde știi că, ok, tot dealul ăsta are cupru, îi timpul să-l radem pe tot de pe fața pământului, asta e 2 la mână, 3, unde se duce tot materialul care e scos? Că cred că nu e numai cupru aici, că mă gândesc că nu e ca pe Minecraft, că cred că e cupru ascuns în pământ, nu? Sau între piatră și după aia tu trebuie piatra aia să o filtrezi, nu? Depinde de densitatea minereului găsit în pământul respectiv. Păi da, uite, asta e cum să zic, e un răspuns așa foarte generalizat. Depinde de densitate. Deci mai mult te duci așa la orbete. Hai să săpăm tădealul, să vedem dacă tădealul are cupru sau nu. În construcție. Strip mining original. Păi piatra e separată de minereu cu cianină. Se fac studii înainte, evident. Păi da, dar mă gândesc că oricum, la finalul zilei nu e nicio garanție că tot ăsta poate să aibă. Poate pe studiile alea s-o nimerit că acolo unde au trimis probele fix acolo era câte un zăcământ din ăsta, dar nu chiar peste tot. Deci eu numai de-aia zic, eu chiar nu știu cum funcționează chestiile astea și mereu mi s-au părut interesante.
If I told you that I used to be a sulfuric acid reporter. Well, you should, because it's true. I did that for a couple of years, about 10, 12 years ago. And what I'm going to do now is use that
Păi laserul lui Ceaușescu avea și X-ray, vedeau pe unde e cupru. Bă... De-aia o picat industria, mă. O căzut Ceaușescu, care era și singurul care putea să manevreze laserul. N-a mai avut nici X-ray, nu s-o mai exploata zăcământul ăla. Bă, chiar are sens.
Wonderful expertise to explain copper mining to you in very simplified terms, because it's actually quite important to the story. I just mentioned ore. Now, you might have heard this word before. Basically, copper, like pretty much every mined metal, is trapped inside a rock. That's the ore. And there are two ways of getting the nice shiny copper out, depending on what type of copper ore you're dealing with. Oxide ores are friendly and chill. You can literally dissolve the copper out of them using a weak sulfuric acid solution in a process called leaching. The copper simply melts into the acid solution and it runs off the ore. It's clean, it's easy, it barely creates any waste, and you can even recycle the acid. It's dream stuff. But Roșia-Poieni isn't that lucky. This mine is a sulfide ore mine, and sulfide ores absolutely suck. The copper in these ores don't dissolve in acid in any useful way, so you can't do any of the nice tidy leaching that you can for oxide ores. Instead, you have to prepare the ore for the other main form of copper processing, smelting, which you've likely heard of. And no, it's not as simple as just chucking the ore in a furnace and melting out the metal. It's so much worse than that. First, you have to basically grind the entire mountain into a flour-fine dust and use something called froth flotation, which was created by humans purely as a means of spitting in the face of Mother Nature, because to say this process is environmentally damaging is the understatement of the century. In froth flotation, you mix the now powdered sulfide ore with water until you get a grey sludge. Then you add chemicals called xanthates that stick to the copper minerals and cause them to float, and add lime as a pH regulator to stop other unwanted minerals from floating. Then you pump air through the whole mixture, add a frothing agent, and the copper minerals stick to the surface of the bubbles while the useless rock and other waste sinks to the bottom. You skim the bubbly copper layer off the top, dry it, and that becomes copper concentrate, which you can then sell to a smelter who will wave a magic wand and turn it into lovely cathode copper for electronics or construction. Here's the real problem.
Păi și cum o descoperi lumea că poate să facă treaba asta? Mie mi se pare extrem de complicat. N-ai niciun ghid, n-ai niciun wiki, nimica pe care trebuie să-l citești înainte. Păi și oamenii înainte de epoca industrială cum topeau chestiile astea? Cum le extrăgeau? Sau pe ăsta nu le extrăgeau? Ziceau că pe ăsta nu putem să le extragem. Le extrăgeau pe ăla, că cred că acid sulfuric, cred că de ăla cred că poate să-l faci jos mai ușor. Trial and error. Păi da, mă, dar uite, mie mi se pare foarte interesantă chestia asta. Uite, și cuprul avem destul de mult timp. Mii de ani. În epoca bronzului, când o descoperit ăștia că pot să facă aliaje cu cupru, cum extrăgeau ei cupru din piatră? Aia mie mi se pare interesant. Probabil nu era 100% cupru, nu era așa pur, mă gândesc. Deci era așa cum să nimerea. Dar aia mi se pare interesant. Știi că trebuie să-l treci prin toate procesele astea chimice înainte să-l poți topi. Eu mă gândeam că pur și simplu iei piatra, o țăpi undeva unde e foarte cald și se topește. Îl sugeau cu dinții. Îți zic eu ce să-mi sugi tu mie cu dinții, Mișule. Te mă enervezi.
Is a very low-grade copper mine, meaning the ore yields only a tiny bit of copper per ton. Specifically, this mine contains 0.38% grade ores, meaning that of all the millions of tons of shit that's been dug up and ground down and mashed up and mixed up with chemicals, just 0.38% of it ends up as usable copper concentrate. And that means that the remaining 99.62% is a heap of disgusting sludge that is A, completely unusable and not recyclable, and B, outrageously toxic. This nasty waste is referred to as tailings and is usually kept in tailings dams, which keep it on site and fenced off from the public. But this was 1970s Romania, so instead, yeah, we'll get to it. In 1977, so the year before Cuprumân broke ground on the mine, the Romanian government offered the residents of Geamăna around $2,000 each in order to vacate their homes, with around 300 people taking the money and running, which is most of the village. A few brave residents refused and stayed, but I imagine that they maybe wished they'd taken the money considering what happened next.
2000 de biștari numai să pleci? Și-o mutat în Târgu Mureș pe toți.
By 1983, so after 5 years of construction, operations began at Roșia-Poieni, and by 1986, the sheer volume of tailings led to a question. Where would they put all the sludge? Rather than creating an entire tailings dam and reservoir system on site like a normal or responsible mine would, they were like, oh shit, look, just north of the mine, that's a perfectly tailings reservoir-shaped valley just waiting to be filled with sludge. Wait, you're saying people live there? Am I supposed to care about that? So yes, they did exactly what you're thinking. In 1986, once the residents who accepted the payout had left and the holdouts had moved up the hill from Geamăna proper, Cuprumân built a dam across this northeastern exit of the valley and started pumping all the disgusting toxic tailings into the basin.
Cum era de
Stories
nu-i
like Geamăna
anunța?
tend to leave you
Cum era de nu-i anunța pe oameni? Numai se trezeau cu mâzgă pe acolo.
with a series of uncomfortable questions. This very video shows how destructive decisions can be when nobody is held accountable, but the follow-up question is just as important. When environmental damage has already been done, is there anything that can still be repaired? And that question is exactly why I joined and partnered with Planet Wild for this video. Planet Wild is a community-based nature protection organization. Every month, the community of over 20,000 members, including myself, fund a mission to the basin because the sludge wouldn't run on its own. It's too viscous, it's too thick and solid. So they needed to pump water in first to fill the basin a little bit, and then they started adding the sludge after that. By this point, Roșia-Poieni was processing about 10 to 12 million tons of ore per year. And obviously 99% of that being waste, that means that basically 10 to 12 million tons of waste.
Încă o întrebare de prost. Nu-i periculos pur și simplu să stai pe aici? Adică mă gândesc că substanțele astea poate emană și ceva gaze?
Was being fed into the lake every year. And in fact, this is probably the best vantage point because this is the main outflow of tailings from the mine into the lake. And that there, where the sun is just going down, is the mine. By 1987, it had covered almost all of the houses. And by 1989, 3 years after the sludge started entering the valley, it reached the cemetery, up here by the church. From an ecological perspective, this whole scheme was already a complete and utter catastrophe. But from a human perspective, this was the low point. The residents of Geamăna, who had already been forced to move from their ancestral homes, begged Cuprumân to relocate the dead bodies of their loved ones before the sludge consumed the cemetery, something that Ceausescu's government actually pledged to do. But, predictably, he never followed through, and the cemetery is now buried under meters of toxic slurry, likely long having been dissolved like everything else underneath the surface. To stop the destruction of his village and the cemetery, one resident, Nicolae Prația, went on a crusade to protest to everyone he could in any position of power, even attending parliamentary sessions in the capital Bucharest. And
O zis cuvântul cu P pe vremea lui Ceaușescu? Nu prea merge.
Apparently, believing the United Kingdom was, quote, a country where justice was sacred. He wrote a letter to Queen Elizabeth II asking her to do something, but she was simply too busy being a nonce-protecting parasite to help out. And so, the town was swallowed whole. Today, all that remains is the tiny tip of the church spire poking out of the lake of poison. The waste is upwards of 90 meters deep. There's something particularly brutal about this whole scenario which makes it stand out even among stories of other flooded towns. This isn't a layer of water covering a Romanian version of Atlantis or some other perfectly preserved sunken city ready to be explored by intrepid divers. It's a churning, grotesque mass of some of the most destructive chemicals on the planet, and it has likely completely disintegrated the village of Geamăna underneath. I say likely because the toxic sludge is so deadly and thick and impenetrable that we have actually never been able to check what lies below the surface. Instead, scientists have calculated that almost everything, from the bricks that made up the houses that people once called home to, unfortunately, the cemetery, have been dissolved and become part of the toxic slurry that destroyed them in the first place. So this begs the question, what fucking devil chemicals are in this sludge? One thing that kind of surprised me and annoyed me when I was researching this is that everyone from like other YouTubers to Reuters, you know, respected news wires, whenever they talked about this lake, they would all say, oh, it's been poisoned with cyanide. And that is not true. There's no cyanide in this lake because cyanide is not used in copper mining. It's used in gold mining, but not copper. So there is no cyanide in here. It probably won't make you feel much better to know that what's in here is probably quite a lot worse than cyanide. If you go back to the mining process, you might assume that the toxic part comes from all the chemicals used in the froth flotation. And sure, xanthates are unpleasant and they apparently smell like death, but they break down incredibly quickly in water and they disappear within hours or days. And they certainly aren't corrosive. Because Roșia Poieni is a sulfide ore deposit, all the leftover waste after the copper is removed in the froth flotation process is full of sulfide minerals. And sulfide minerals throw a spectacular tantrum.
Cacalacid, stai, ce era? Așa. Cu 2S, uite, ăsta e FES 2 și F 1 minus X is S.
A spectacular tantrum when exposed to air and water. Pyrite is the main culprit. When it oxidizes, it produces the main enemy of this whole saga, sulfuric acid. And you don't need a sulfuric acid reporter to tell you that sulfuric acid does not fuck around.
Aia înseamnă că pute destul de tare pe acolo, așa e?
And this lake contains a mountain of it. The pH level in here is thought to be between 1.5 and 2, which is on the level of sort of battery acid. Once that sulfuric acid starts to form, basically all bets are off. For a start, you won't be swimming in here anytime soon. Or if you try, it'll be the last dip of your life. Acids of this strength immediately dissolve
deci dacă cazi în
in
ăsta te
contact.
topește.
You'd be dead within minutes. And even if you fell in and were immediately pulled back out, you'd need substantial medical attention to stop your skin burning off and you dying anyway. And as you can see, there aren't exactly any massive medical centers near here. But this sulfuric acid also has a strange effect on the sludge itself. The sludge starts producing the acid, and then in turn, that acid starts dissolving everything else in the waste in a never-ending cycle. Most notably, it dissolves other metals in the waste, such as iron, zinc, manganese, arsenic, and even small amounts of copper that didn't get captured during flotation. And all of these metals end up swirling around in the water and...
Păi și chestia asta nu poate să fie refolosită la altceva. Nu știu.
acid reacting further with oxygen and with each other. And that's what gives Geamăna its completely insane colors. Iron gives the rusty orange color, copper gives a bright turquoise, aluminium makes the white streaks, and the yellow-green comes from sulfur compounds reacting with the rest of the mix. Stripped of context, and on a sunnier day than I was here, it can be weirdly beautiful, despite the fact that it's almost swallowed the last remaining evidence that there was ever a town here at all. Unfortunately, the level of the sludge is still rising rapidly. This is 2023, this is 2024, this is now. It's rising literally by around a meter per year because, and you're not going to believe me when I say this, they're still pumping toxic waste into the lake. I know, it sounds crazy, but let me explain.
Mie mi se pare extrem de normal.
I was expecting this to be bad, based on what I've read, but I was not expecting it to be anywhere near this bad.
So everything is coated in this powder or this sort of sludge. You might be able to see it's sort of just drifting through the air, and it's covering me, and it smells very weird, and I feel like I shouldn't be breathing it in and probably shouldn't be here at all. This is horrendous. You'd think that this would have been stopped years ago, maybe once Ceausescu got popped in 1989, or once Romania joined the EU in 2007 and the bloc told them to sort their shit out. But no, Roșia Poieni is still sending tailings into the valley, and there are a couple of reasons why. The first is, obviously, corruption. This isn't a moral judgment. Romanians themselves are keenly aware of the fact that Romania has one of the most corrupt governmental setups in the EU. Cuprumin, which owns and operates the mine, is still state-owned and enjoys remarkable political protection. Local officials don't want the mine closed, national officials don't want the mine closed, and Brussels can't exactly march in with a big "stop being a biohazard" stamp and fix it for them. Independent geologists and environmental auditors have warned that this whole operation from the mine to the lake should have been shut down years ago, and this water should have been treated starting also years ago. But calculations have shown that treating this water is like virtually impossible. It would take billions and billions of euros and take decades, if not longer. So instead, everyone just does what corrupt governments do best. Nothing. The other thing keeping the flow of sludge going is that technically, stopping would be even worse. If we once again jump back to the froth flotation, you'll remember that lime...
Bă, mie mi se pare că nu plătim destule taxe, deci eu cred că ar trebui să ni le și crească.
is added at one point as a pH regulator in order to force waste material to sink away from the bubbles. But pH regulators, as the name suggests, also have, a calming effect on acid and make them far less potent. And these regulators are still present in the fresh sludge that's being pumped down from the mine into the valley, meaning that there's not only a steady flow of horrendous waste being pumped into the valley, but also a regulator in the waste to stop it from becoming too acidic. So, strangely, if the toxic tailings from the mine stopped flowing into the lake, it wouldn't actually be healed. It wouldn't start healing itself. It wouldn't get better. The opposite would happen. The lack of a pH regulator being pumped into the lake means that the acidity would spike to such a degree that it would actually, the sludge would start dissolving the dam itself. The dam
Vai
would
de
hold back
pula
the
mea.
sludge. And yeah, if you thought things were already bad, if this dam fails, oh my God, I'm just going to leave it there. If this dam fails, a wave of toxic slurry would roar down the valley and straight into the river Ariash, coating everything in acid. The Ariash then flows into the Mureș, which flows into the Tisza, which flows into the Danube, and then flows into the Black Sea. In other words, it wouldn't just poison this small region of Romania, it would contaminate an entire river system stretching across half of Europe.
Futu-ți gura, mătii, Nicolae Ceaușescu. Mă duc, te scot din coșciug și te bat.
Europe. We actually have a case study for this. In 2000, a gold
Stai! Aici e turda. Bă, deci nu mă gândeam. Cum, mă? Coai că nu e în coșciug. Dar în ce l-o băgat? Bă! Deci ăsta-i prețul pe care îl plătesc, mă. Dispare turda de pe fața pământului, dar dispare și Târgu Mureșu, dispare Seghedu, dispare Novi Sad, mă, dispare Ruse, fai, mă. Bă, uite și Brăila, Galați o să fie ok, Brăila nu. Clujul scapă, Firaș să fii tu Cluj, tot timpul scapi tu de toate chestiile, nu-mi vine să cred, mă. Crezi Chirile în Cluj, că se mută toți Târgu Mureșeni în Cluj, că nu o să mai existe Târgu Mureș.
Romania, it would contaminate an entire river system
Orice se
stretching
întâmplă,
across
mă, în
half
țara
of
asta,
Europe.
mă.
We actually have a case
Orice se întâmplă în țara asta au clujenii de profitat, mă. Deci nu-mi vine să cred.
study for this. In 2000, a gold mine spill at Baia Mare, which was also in Romania, but we'll ignore that for now, sent cyanide-contaminated water into the Tisza River and killed 80% of its fish. And that disaster released a comparatively tiny amount of waste. Geamăna is orders of magnitude larger. So at present, Romania is stuck in the stupidest catch-22 possible, where stopping the very thing that destroyed this valley would eventually destroy even more of Romania's ecosystem. The average Romanian has foresight far better than their governments. In the year 2000, from an ecological...
Stai, nu ce am văzut acolo. Cui pasă, mă, că uite, avem Vlad Casino, bagă la Vlad Casino, bagă la păcănele.
In the year 2000, Canadian mining company Gabriel Resources, who I'd never heard of, but I'm annoyed that I share a name with them, was given a license for mining gold at the planned Roșia Montana mine, just 14 kilometers away from Geamăna. This mine, planned to be the largest gold mine in Europe, was an open-pit project proposed to use 12,000 tons of cyanide each year to extract gold, and was expected to require the destruction of 3 villages in order to facilitate its construction. Also, as a side note, I think this is where the confusion over cyanide at Geamăna comes from, the fact that Roșia Montana was going to use cyanide. In 2013, the government was ramping up its efforts to approve the mine, but hundreds of thousands of Romanians, galvanized by the Baia Mare cyanide disaster back in 2000, took to the streets to protest Roșia Montana, calling for the cancellation of the project. And after months of unrest, the project was cancelled, and instead, Roșia Montana was actually listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site due to its ancient history, basically banning mining in the region forever. So well done, Romanian people. You absolutely knocked that one out the park. But what about Geamăna?
Vă dați seama? Să băga cianură acolo la Roșia Montană, se făcea ca o ciorbă de chimicale pe aici. Poate dacă se atingeau ciorba de la Roșia Montană cu ciorba de la Geamăna, cine știe ce creatură ieșea de aici.
What happens next? The sad answer is nothing. Nothing happens next. We're way past the point of no return.
Nu se
As I said,
întâmplă, mă,
the
nimic.
sludge needs to keep coming in order to stop the corrosion from getting completely out of control, and there's simply no way of clearing this up in the meantime. And this isn't me saying there are ways of doing it, but they're just too expensive. This is me saying fixing this mess is pretty much impossible. There's nothing we can add to stabilize the chemicals. There's no realistic way to move billions of tons of this stuff. And even if we could, where would it go? Who would inherit this problem next?
This is a once-in-a-generation engineering failure that has no solution. It's a monster that humans have created that we now just have to live with. Geamăna is gone, its buildings are dissolved, and the valley it sits in has become a horrific chemical scar that will outlast everyone watching this video.
Mă, acum depinde la cum tu ești la perspectivă, adică Pământul oricum mai are numai 1 miliard de ani cât să-și mai poată să susțină viața, că după aia o să fim înghițiți de faptul că soarele o să-și mărească volumul și planeta asta nu o să mai fie în stare să mențină viață, că o să fie prea cald. Deci, da. No, se mai întâmplă. Noi oricum suntem așa numai un mic filler episod din anime-ul ăsta numit Viață pe Pământ și așa. Probleme pentru altă generație. Nici nu cred că o să mai fie altă generație după.